Hello and welcome to North Star Oasis for this 25th day of July 2019. I'm your host, Jeff Williams. We're here for another jam-packed, action-filled information overload. Summer's here. Hope you're enjoying it. This is the weekend of the Oshkosh EAA AirVenture Air Show. A couple of years ago, we were out there. Was trying to kind of hoping to make it this year, but it doesn't appear that way. But the Vietnam Veterans, the moving wall of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is in Stillwater this weekend, so I hope you get a chance to check it out. It's at the old ball fields off of, was it 6th Avenue? Not too far from Fairview Cemetery. So if you get a chance this weekend, please get out there to Stillwater and check out the moving wall from the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And we are going to go into our programming today, speaking of memorials, because we just had the 50th anniversary of the first man setting foot on the moon, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Apollo 11. One of the people who was able to leave a lasting legacy and make it all possible was Christopher Columbus Kraft. He was one of NASA's legendary flight directors. As a matter of fact, I think he may have been the first. It was Chris Kraft who designed mission control. It was Chris Kraft who had written the first mission rules for the Project Mercury back around 1959. 59 to 61. It was Chris Kraft who made the initial hires for the flight controllers and the flight directors. It was Chris Kraft who made sure that this team pulled together that was able to make what later became the Apollo mission possible. It was Chris Kraft who was able to keep things moving to where we got every single astronaut that we sent into space in the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo projects back to Earth. And it was Chris Kraft who, 2 days after the 50th anniversary of the landing of Apollo 11, passed away at the age of 95. So he passed away earlier this week. And it was at the anniversary of Apollo 11, the 50th anniversary, when Chris Kraft went into hospice. So he at least was able to live through that 50th anniversary and then went downhill from there, and then he passed away on Monday. So we are going to give you two videos. We're going to play them back to back. The first one is from a TV station in Houston on remembering Chris Kraft. And then right after that, we're just going to go right into a tribute that NASA put together as they remember their legendary flight director.
Begin tonight with breaking news on the passing of NASA and space legend Chris Kraft.
During this 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon mission, the space agency announcing the death of a legendary NASA flight director. Our Phil Archer live in the newsroom now with the legacy Kraft leaves behind. Phil?
Well, Bill, the nation in Houston lost a true pioneer today. Chris Kraft was a legend at NASA. He was one of the original scientists picked to man that agency when it was first formed in 1958. He became NASA's sole flight director for the first manned missions of the Mercury program. In the process, he developed NASA doctrine for managing space flights in those early days. The Mission Control Building at JSC is now named for him. He went on to help plan the Apollo missions to the moon, and then from there to become director of the Johnson Space Center in the early 70s. He served at that post until his retirement in 1982. He was smart, plain-spoken, and feisty, and that was on display when I interviewed him in December 2016.
I was privileged to be in that position. Very privileged. I mean, who the hell was going to be flight director on the first space flight of first 7, actually more than that, 15 or so.
He told me that he felt his prime responsibility at NASA was to get the astronauts back alive, and he lived up to that responsibility. Chris Kraft, the legend, gone at 95. I'm Phil Archer.
All right.
NASA is the best return on investment that this country has ever seen, and is today the best government agency to get a return on investment. And it is where our future lies.
So to Christopher Kraft, we say thank you. And you will always be remembered in some capacity for your contributions to human spaceflight so long ago. Now we're going to turn the page a little bit here, and we're actually going to kind of look at this for the rest of the hour. And there's been a lot of talk lately about Google. Google, of course, owns YouTube. And Google likes to censor things that they don't necessarily agree with. Not necessarily that there's anything wrong with them. And recently there was a congressional committee hearing on Google censorship. And we're going to take a look, because we use the material from Prager University quite a bit, just about every week. And we are actually going to take a look as we head into part 2 of the 10 Commandments. A couple of weeks ago we did part 1. So we went through a discussion of Commandments 1 through 5 and an overview. Today we're going to finish the second half of that. So we're going to go through Commandments 6 through 10. But we're also going to talk a little bit about the censorship issue, because I don't see anything in here that can be construed as offensive. I really don't see it. Google may not like it, but there's I think if you actually take a look at Commandment number 10, that really defines, in my opinion, Commandment number 10 defines liberalism in a nutshell. And I'll speak, or Commandment 10, yeah, Commandment 10. Commandment 9, that also has a lot to deal with what's going on in Washington right now. And so, yeah, there are some things that may make the far left uncomfortable. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the far left is right. So when the censorship of Prager University came up recently, we took a look at this, and we're going to actually look more extensively in a future episode on Googling versus censorship. But we're going to, for the sake of the rest of today, we're going to take a look at two sections here on the censoring of Prager University videos, primarily the 10 Commandments. First one that we're going to play right now is of the Google response and Google explanation or excuse as to why they've actually done some censorship on Dennis Prager's Prager University. So let's take a look at that right now, and then we'll give you Dennis Prager's response in just a little bit.
You have repeatedly made reference to violent extremism and hate speech. One of the companies that has been demonetized by Google repeatedly is Prager University. Dennis Prager is sitting here. He will be testifying on the next panel. Mr. Prager is, in my judgment, a highly learned, erudite individual, studied and well thought on a great many issues. And in my experience, I've always found that I learn when listening to Mr. Prager, whether I happen to agree with a particular issue or not. And yet, YouTube actively censors the content Mr. Prager is producing. Is it your view that Mr. Prager is somehow disseminating dangerous ideas or ideas that fit into the buckets you were talking about of violent extremism or hate speech?
No, Senator. Maybe if I can just explain. Mr. Prager is a YouTube success story. Mr. Prager has more than 2 million followers, as I understand it. Mr. Prager's, and all of Mr. Prager's content is available on YouTube, the main YouTube channel. We do have a very small % of our subscribers who opt for what we call restricted mode. These are mostly institutions like churches or perhaps schools, where there's certain more mature content that they choose not to have access to. Now, this is less than 2% of the overall YouTube watchers, but we do feel it's important to give those institutions that degree of control. There is a small % of Mr. Prager's overall content, as I understand it, less than a quarter of his content, that is deemed to be in that category of more mature. And so for that very small percentage, they will not have access to Mr. Prager's more mature content. Other than that, it is complete. And just to be clear, this is content, for instance, maybe perfectly acceptable to watch, but for those who perhaps references to violence or war or rape, things like that. So that's the
So
that's the
my
basis.
understanding, just for the record, is that PragerU has produced 325-minute videos, and that YouTube has censored 56 of them, so roughly 20%. Among those that are censored include a video on the Ten Commandments. Another one censored includes a video on the history of the nation of Israel. The restrictions are purportedly for blocking things like pornography, but apparently in YouTube's world, talking about the Ten Commandments and the nation of Israel is comparable and should be blocked.
Respectfully, Senator, that's not right.
Okay. Please
what
explain.
what I was trying to explain is all of Mr. Prager, the Ten Commandments, all those are available to 98% of YouTube viewers, 98.5, I believe. 1.5% of our viewers have activated, again, this restricted mode. Churches, schools, maybe libraries that don't want to have their viewers exposed to more mature content. The video, I believe the Ten Commandments video, for instance, contains references to murder and I believe potentially Nazism or World War II, something along those lines. There are other videos that have in that category, in the number that you referenced, 56, whatever it is, that may make reference to rape. That's the reason, but they're not censored. They are simply, they're available to everybody who's using normal YouTube. They are not available to the small subset who have chosen to activate restricted mode.
Well, you're going to get the chance to be the judge of that in just a few minutes. But now that you've heard what the Google representative had to say, now let's take a look at what Dennis Prager has to say. He's got two clips that we've put together back to back. So the first one, you're going to see his I think his opening statement and questioning with Senator Ted Cruz. And then there's also going to be a section at the end that's already been spliced together showing questioning with Senator Marsha Blackburn from Tennessee. And so we're going to play this next because this you've definitely got to hear.
We'll start with you.
Microphone.
Okay. Do I get my 20
You would
seconds
think
back?
a radio host would know how to
You
do
would.
that.
You would. That is a very fine point. I have no response. I will take just a moment, because my opening comment is under 5 minutes, just to respond on the issue of the Ten Commandments video that was placed on the restricted list by Google. The representative from Google mentioned that a reason that it would be on the restricted list was that it contains mentions of murder. So I was thinking I have a solution that will, I think, appeal to Google. I will re-release it as the 9 Commandments. That should solve the problem of including murder in my discussion of the 10 Commandments. And as regards the swastika, yes, there is a swastika. It is, again, in the commandment of do not murder, wherein I show that murder, there are people who believe murder is all right even today, and I use the swastika and the hammer and sickle as 2 examples. I would think we would want young people to associate the swastika with evil. That was why I had a swastika. It is an honor to be invited to speak in the United States Senate, but I wish I were not so honored because the subject of this hearing, Google and YouTube's, and for that matter, Twitter and Facebook's suppression of internet content on ideological grounds, threatens the future of America more than any external enemy. In fact, never in American history has there been as strong a threat to freedom of speech as there is today. Before addressing this, however, I think it important that you know a bit about me and the organization I co-founded, Prager University, PragerU, as it is often referred to. I was born in Brooklyn, New York. My late father, Max Prager, was a CPA and an Orthodox Jew who volunteered to serve in the U.S. Navy at the start of World War II. My father's senior class thesis at the City College of New York was on anti-Semitism in America. Yet despite his keen awareness of the subject, he believed that Jews living in America were the luckiest Jews to have ever lived. He was right. Having taught Jewish history at Brooklyn College, written a book on anti-Semitism, and fought Jew hatred my whole life, I thank God for living in America. It breaks my heart that a vast number of young Americans have not only not been taught how lucky they are to be Americans, but have been taught either how unlucky they are or how ashamed they should be. It breaks my heart for them because contempt for one's country leaves a terrible hole in one's soul, and because ungrateful people always become unhappy and angry people. And it breaks my heart for America because no good country can survive when its people have contempt for it. I have been communicating this appreciation of America for 35 years as a radio talk show host, the last 20 in national syndication with the Salem Radio Network, an organization that is a blessing in American life. One reason I started PragerU was to communicate America's moral purpose and moral achievements, both to young Americans and to young people around the world. With 1 billion views a year and with more than half of the viewers under age 35, PragerU has achieved some success. My philosophy of life is easily summarized. God wants us to be good, period. God without goodness is fanaticism, and goodness without God will not long endure. Everything I and PragerU do emanates from belief in the importance of being a good person. That some label us extreme or quote haters only reflects on the character and the broken moral compass of those making such accusations. They are the haters and extremists. PragerU releases a 5-minute video every week. Our presenters include 3 former prime ministers, 4 Pulitzer Prize winners, liberals, conservatives, gays, blacks, Latinos, atheists, believers, Jews, Christians, Muslims, and professors and scientists from MIT, Harvard, Stanford, and a dozen other universities. Do you think the Secretary General of NATO, or the former prime ministers of Norway, Canada, or Spain, or the late Charles Krauthammer, or Philip Hamburger, distinguished professor of law at Columbia Law School, would make a video for an extreme or hate-filled site? The idea is not only preposterous, it is a smear. Yet Google, which owns YouTube, has restricted access to 56 of our 320 5-minute videos and to other videos we produce. Restricted means families that have a filter to avoid pornography and violence cannot see that video. It also means that no school or library can show that video. Google has even restricted access to a video on the 10 Commandments, as we have seen. Yes, the 10 Commandments. We have repeatedly asked Google why our videos are restricted. No explanation is ever given. But of course we know why, because they come from a conservative perspective. Liberals and conservatives differ on many issues, but they have always agreed that free speech must be preserved. While the left has never supported free speech, liberals always have. I therefore appeal to liberals to join us in fighting on behalf of America's crowning glory, free speech. Otherwise, I promise you, one day you will say, first they came after conservatives, and I said nothing. And then they came after me, and there was no one left to speak up for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Prager.
Mr. Prager, I have been to your website, know your work, and I share your frustration with Google and YouTube, and I know that you filed a lawsuit against both companies in 2017, and I feel for you in sharing your frustration. As you probably know, I have borne the worst of Google's culture, their corporate culture, and their employees' political bias. And yes, indeed, Dr. Tripodi, you and I could have a good discussion about this, but they do bring that bias to work. and it does inform those algorithms. And one of their senior engineers actually singled me out for my political views and then doubled down on that. And then Google came along and refused to put up an ad from the Tennessee Republican Party in support of my campaign. So is there bias? Yes. Have I experienced firsthand? Yes, I have. And, but Mr. Prager, I've got just a couple of questions before we move on, and I want to go through these quickly. How did Google and YouTube's censorship harm your ability to communicate your message online?
Well, it's fairly evident if things cannot be seen by any family that restricts pornography and violence, if no school can see it, by definition, if it's on the restricted list, if no library can show it, that's a very serious restriction, especially given that our target audience is young people. So they're depriving us of the very people that we most want to touch with our message. So that's pretty dramatic. And
so how did your viewership go down after they restricted you?
Well, I can't give you a number, obviously. There's no way of knowing what number of people are in homes that have already have filters and don't even therefore know about a video because it just can't be accessed. We know that many teachers try to show our videos in classes, and they can do it on their own, but they can't do it through the school.
What explanation has Google given you for the restrictions?
Well, you used the great word frustration. We have gotten none. And actually, it's almost unbelievable because if you look at the list, and like the Ten Commandments being a perfect example of how people will go, you got to be kidding. Well, I finally found out today, you did. We all heard. The representative of Google told us why the Ten Commandments video was taken down, because it contains murder. So, as I said, we have a solution. We'll put up one without "thou shalt not murder" in it. But that's so absurd as to be hilarious. This will be something I will replay on my radio show for years. That is the level of absurdity. I feel like I'm in a Monty Python skit here when he says something like that. The only possible explanation for all of this is they don't like PragerU because we're a very, very influential conservative voice touching a lot of lives. There is no other explanation.
I thank you all. My time's expired, but thank you for your attention to the issue.
Thank you.
And Mr. Chairman, thank you for the...
So now we get to let you be the judge. Now that you've heard the argument, you've heard from the Google representative, and you've heard from Dennis Prager, we are now going to take a look at the last 5 commandments of the 10 commandments. And if you go back into our archives on either Google or Facebook, Google.com, YouTube.com/NorthStarOasis or Facebook.com/NorthStarOasis, you will find our previous episodes, including the one where we highlight the first of the 5 commandments. So now we are going to take a look at the one that is specified in question. Do not murder, commandment number 6. So now watch this and then think back to those arguments. Is this mature content? Is this something that you think should actually be censored? Or are you going to laugh and say, Google wants to censor that? Because this is what the whole argument is over. What, of course, is acceptable speech? So if you're giving a philosophical answer to the 10 Commandments, the commandment says, do not murder, and you're using a swastika and a hammer and sickle to drive home the point that you shall not murder, is that a bad thing? Well, let's take a look at that video. Here is commandment number 6, do not murder.
You would think that of all the 10 Commandments, the one that needs the least explaining is the 6th. Because it seems so clear. It is the one that the King James Bible, the most widely used English translation of the Bible, translates as, thou shalt not kill. Yet the truth is quite the opposite. This is probably the least well understood of the 10 Commandments. The reason is that the Hebrew original does not say, do not kill. It says, do not murder. Both Hebrew and English have two words for taking a life. One is kill, harag in Hebrew, and the other is murder, ratzach in Hebrew. The difference between the two is enormous. Kill means, one, taking any life, whether of a human being or an animal. Two, taking a human life, deliberately or by accident. Three, taking a human life, legally or illegally, morally or immorally. On the other hand, murder can only mean one thing: the illegal or immoral taking of a human life. That's why we say, I killed a mosquito, not I murdered a mosquito. And that's why we would say the worker was accidentally killed, not the worker was accidentally murdered. So why did the King James translation of the Bible use the word kill rather than murder? Because 400 years ago, when the translation was made, kill was synonymous with murder. As a result, some people don't realize that English has changed since 1610, and therefore think that the Ten Commandments prohibits all killing. But of course it doesn't. If the Ten Commandments forbade killing, we would all have to be vegetarians. Killing animals would be prohibited. And we would all have to be pacifists, since we could not kill even in self-defense. However, you don't have to know how the English language has evolved in order to understand that the Ten Commandments could not have prohibited all killing. The very same part of the Bible that contains the Ten Commandments, the 5 books of Moses, the Torah as it is known by Jews, commands the death penalty for murder, allows killing in war, prescribes animal sacrifice, and allows eating meat. A correct understanding of the commandment against murder is crucial, because while virtually every modern translation correctly translates the commandment as do not murder, many people cite the King James translation to justify two positions that have no biblical basis: opposition to capital punishment and pacifism. Regarding capital punishment and the Bible, the only law that appears in each one of the 5 books of Moses is that murderers be put to death. Opponents of the death penalty are free to hold the view that all murderers should be allowed to live, but they are not free to cite the Bible to support their view. Yet many do, and they always cite the commandment, do not kill. But that, as should now be abundantly clear, is not what the commandment says, and it is therefore an invalid argument. As regards pacifism, the belief that it is always wrong to kill a human being, again, anyone is free to hold this position, as immoral as it may be, and what other word than immoral can one use to describe forbidding the killing of someone who was in the process of murdering innocent men, women, and children in, let's say, a movie theater or a school? But it is dishonest to cite the commandment against murder to justify pacifism. There is moral killing, most obviously when done in self-defense against an aggressor, and there is immoral killing. And the word for that is murder. The Ten Commandments are portrayed on 2 tablets. The 5 commandments on the second tablet all concern our treatment of fellow human beings. The first one on that list is do not murder. Why? Because murder is the worst act a person can commit. The other 4 commandments prohibiting stealing, adultery, giving false testimony, and coveting are all serious offenses. But murder leads the list because deliberately taking the life of an innocent person is the most terrible thing we can do. The next time you hear someone cite do not kill when quoting the 6th commandment, gently but firmly explain that it actually says, do not murder. I'm Dennis Prager. Join Prager.
Okay, so tell me, what was worthy of censorship out of that? I hope you actually got a lot out of that. I really hope you did. And right now I'm trying to finish up a master's in history thesis, and I'll have to actually say that reviewing that, I reviewed this a couple of years ago. We actually played the entire 10-part series over the course of 10 weeks back in 2015. And I'm actually reading now about the history of England and English common law, and it dovetails nice with the King James Bible, because that's where this whole thing from do not murder to do not kill actually, resides, was that switch with the King James Bible. And I had just finished reading a whole section of English history as to what was happening at that time, and it was just fascinating stuff. I know that's an aside comment, but do not murder. It doesn't say do not kill. And it is no reason that that should have been censored. So now we're going to go on, take a look at commandment number 7. And I hope you notice, and he pointed it out in the last part of that video. The first 5 commandments talk about individuals, you as a person. They govern people. The second 5, 6 through 10, govern society. So do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, and do not covet. They are the way we need to govern society. And if you as an individual are abiding by the first 5 commandments, then you shouldn't have any problem abiding by the second 5 commandments, which means that if everybody in society obeyed the first 5 commandments, they would obey the second 5 commandments, and we wouldn't have any problems. We would not be murdering, committing adultery, stealing, bearing false witness, or coveting if we actually go back and live our lives individually by the first 5 commandments. That's why they were created to begin with. And so no, Google says, oh, well, you use do not murder, so we're going to censor you. So the video we just showed you can't play it in the library. You can't play the last video in a church. Oh, I'm sorry. You're using pornography filters, and well, it's adult content. So no, you said do not murder. You can't even play a 5-minute video on the commandment number 6 in church. So now we're going to go to commandment number 7. I wonder what Google really thinks of this one. Do not commit adultery.
There's an old joke about the 7th commandment, do not commit adultery. Moses comes down from Mount Sinai and announces, I have good news and bad news. The good news is that I got him down to 10. The bad news is that adultery stays. The joke is telling. The prohibition on a married person having sexual relations with anyone except his or her spouse may be, for many people, the most consistently difficult of the 10 commandments to observe. The reasons shouldn't be hard to guess. One is the enormous power of the sex drive. It can be very hard to keep in check for the entirety of one's marriage, especially when an attractive outsider makes him or herself sexually or romantically available. Another reason is the human desire to love and be loved. For normal people, there is no more powerful emotion than love. If one falls in love with someone while married, it takes great effort not to commit adultery with that person. And if we add in the unfortunate circumstance of a loveless marriage, adultery becomes even more difficult to resist. That's why the joke with which I began is funny, because it reflects truth. Why is adultery prohibited in the 10 Commandments? Because, like the other 9, it is indispensable to forming and maintaining higher civilization. Adultery threatens the very building block of the civilization that the 10 Commandments seeks to create. That building block is the family, a married father and mother and their children. Anything that threatens the family unit is prohibited in the Bible. Adultery is one example. Not honoring one's father and mother is another. And the prohibition on injecting any sexuality into the family unit, incest, is a third example. Why is the family so important? Because without it, social stability is impossible. Because without it, the passing on of society's values from generation to generation is impossible. Because commitment to a wife and children makes men more responsible and mature. Because more than anything else, family meets most women's deepest emotional and material needs. And nothing comes close to the family in giving children a secure and stable childhood. And why does adultery threaten the family? The most obvious reason is that sex with someone other than one spouse can all too easily lead to either or both spouses leaving the marriage. Adultery should not automatically lead to divorce, but it often does. There is another reason adultery can destroy a family. It can lead to pregnancy and then to the birth of a child. That child will, in almost all cases, start out life with no family, meaning no father and mother married to each other to call his or her own. And if adultery doesn't destroy a family, it almost always does terrible harm to a marriage. Aside from the sense of betrayal and loss of trust that it causes, it means that the adulterous partner lives a fraudulent life. When a husband or wife is having sex with someone other than their spouse, their thoughts are constantly about that other person and about how to deceive their spouse. The life of deception that an adulterous affair necessarily entails inevitably damages a marriage, even if the betrayed spouse is unaware of the affair. Finally, the commandment prohibiting adultery doesn't come with an asterisk saying that adultery is okay if both spouses agree to it. Spouses who have extramarital sex with the permission of their husband or wife may not necessarily be hurting their spouse's feelings, but they are still harming the institution of marriage. And protecting the family, not protecting spouses from emotional pain, is the reason for the commandment. Many marriages, sadly, are troubled, and it is not for any of us to stand in judgment of others' behavior in this realm. No one knows what goes on in anyone else's marriage, and if we did, we might often well understand why one or the other sought love outside the marriage. But no higher civilization can be made or can endure that condones adultery. That is why it is prohibited in the Ten Commandments. I'm Dennis Prager. Join Prager University. Subscribe to our...
Wow. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. No wonder Google doesn't like this stuff. So now, I wonder what they have to say about do not steal? Oh, wait. Google steals your consumer data all the time. Never mind. They don't like that either. So let's take a look at commandment number 8, do not steal.
A good case can be made that the 8th commandment, do not steal, is the one commandment that encompasses all the others. How does do not steal encompass the other commandments? Well, murder is the stealing of another person's life. Adultery is the stealing of another person's spouse. Coveting is the desire to steal what belongs to another person. Giving false testimony is stealing justice, and so on. This commandment is unique in another way. It is the only commandment that is completely open-ended. All the other commandments are specific. The 5th commandment, for example, states that it is our parents whom we should honor. The 6th commandment, prohibiting murder, is about taking the life of an innocent human being. The 7th commandment, prohibiting adultery, is also specific to a married person. 2 unmarried people cannot commit adultery. But the commandment against stealing doesn't even hint at what it is we're forbidden to steal, which means that we cannot take anything that belongs to another person. And that, in turn, means 3 big things. First and foremost, the commandment against stealing has always been understood to mean that we are not allowed to steal another human being, what we call kidnapping. That is why no one who had even an elementary understanding of the 8th commandment could ever use the Bible to justify the most common form of slavery, the kidnapping of human beings and selling them into slavery. Critics of the Bible argue that the Bible allowed slavery, but the type of slavery described was in almost all cases what was known as indentured servitude, the selling of oneself to another person for a fixed period of time in order to work off a debt. This had nothing to do with kidnapping free people, such as was done in Africa and elsewhere. That was expressly forbidden by the 8th commandment. The second significant meaning of the commandment against stealing is the sanctity of people's property. Just as we are forbidden to steal people, we are forbidden to steal what people own. It has been shown over and over that private property, beginning with land ownership, is indispensable to creating a free and decent society. Every totalitarian regime takes away private property rights. In the ancient and medieval world, a few rich people owned all the land, and the majority of the population worked on that land for the enrichment of the owners. And then, in 19th century Europe, many socialists argued for taking away private property and giving it to the quote-unquote people. Where that advice was followed, in what came to be known as the communist world, theft of property quickly resulted in theft of freedom and ultimately massive theft of life. The third enormously important meaning of the commandment against stealing concerns the many non-material things each person owns: their reputation, their dignity, their trust, and their intellectual property. Let's quickly run through these. 1, a person's reputation. Stealing a person's good name, whether through libel, slander, or gossip, is a particularly destructive form of theft because, unlike money or property, once a person's good name has been stolen, it can almost never be fully restored. 2, a person's dignity. The act of stealing a person's dignity is known as humiliation, and humiliating a person, especially in public, can do permanent damage to what is perhaps the most precious thing any of us owns: our dignity. 3, a person's trust. Stealing a person's trust is known as deceiving someone. In fact, in Hebrew, a term for tricking someone is gnevat da'at, which literally means stealing knowledge. One example is tricking people into buying something, as when a real estate agent omits telling a prospective purchaser all the flaws in a home in order to make a sale. Another example would be when someone deceives another person with insincere proclamations of love in order to obtain material or sexual favors. 4, a person's intellectual property. This form of theft includes anything from copying software or downloading music and movies without paying for them to stealing a person's words, what we know as plagiarism. Stealing a life, a person, a spouse, material property, intellectual property, a reputation, dignity, or trust. There is hardly any aspect of human life that is not harmed, sometimes irreparably so, by stealing. That is why it is fair to say that if everyone observed only one of the 10 commandments, observing the commandment, "Do not steal," would, all by itself, make a beautiful world. I'm Dennis Prager. Join Prager University. Subscribe.
Well, let me tell you a quick story. Something that happened to me a couple of years ago. I had a bunch of websites, and I had advertising on the websites. Most of them were, the ones that really got the most traffic were my Civil War website and my national debt website. I just ran a monthly accumulating website where I went into the statistics in the U.S. Treasury Department, and then I just configured them in certain categories to make it easy to understand what was happening with the national debt. And I had this service where if you came to my website and there was advertising, you clicked through an ad, then I got a small little portion, unmonetizing. I was in Michigan in January of 2017 when the company that I used for advertising on my websites owed me $125, and that's only an estimate because it's been 2.5 years. It was somewhere around that 125 mark. It was greater than 100, but less than 130. So it was 120, 122, 125. Then all of a sudden, right after I got an email that said, this amount of money will be in your bank account on X day. When X day came, it wasn't there. What happened was then this company accused me of manipulating clicks, which was not true, and then they yanked away the ability for me to get paid and actually to have ads and create my websites as a commercial enterprise. They stole $125 from me. That company was Google with their AdSense platform. You see, what was happening was people were interested in knowing what the national debt was at the end of the Obama administration because it had doubled. It had gone from $10.626 trillion up to $19.993 trillion in 8 years. That's the size of the national debt. It increased. I had the daily rate, I had the monthly rate, I had the yearly rate, I had all of this configured. People, right after the November 2016 election, people were interested in knowing how much the national debt has increased under President Obama, and they were coming to my website to find that information out. Google did not like that information. And then the closer we got to the inauguration day was when Google decided to pull the plug from my AdSense account, and they trumped up some phony terms of service violation. There was only one appeal, and when they denied your appeal, the only source of regress is to actually take them to court, and then per the terms of service, you have to do it in California in their jurisdiction. Over $125, I'm not going to hire an attorney in California at $300 an hour to go after them for $125. They know that, I know that. But that does not neglect the fact that they stole from me. Per the terms of service agreement, they were supposed to pay me $125. Instead, they trumped up phony charges as an alleged violation of the terms of service, which did not occur, and then they took $125 away from me by not paying me. That was the definition of do not steal. They stole. No wonder they don't like the 10 Commandments. So now, what about commandment number 9? Do not bear false witness. Well, let's take a look and see what happens.
False witness against your neighbor. This means two things. Do not lie when testifying in court, and do not lie, period. Remember, in order for an action to be prohibited or demanded in the 10 Commandments, it has to be fundamental to making civilization. As important as donkey riding might have been when the 10 Commandments were given, the 10 Commandments contains no commandment to ride your donkey responsibly. A society can survive bad donkey drivers, but it cannot survive contempt for truth, whether inside or outside a courtroom. If people testify falsely in a courtroom, there can be no justice, and without even the hope of justice, there can be no civilization. The Hebrew Bible was so adamant on this subject that the punishment imposed on a witness who gave false testimony was the same as the punishment that would have been meted out to the accused had the false testimony been believed. In the case of a crime that would be punishable by death, therefore, the false witness was liable to be put to death. But the commandment is clearly concerned with truth generally, not only in a courtroom. Both the great 12th century Jewish commentator Ibn Ezra and one of the most influential biblical scholars of the 20th century, Brevard Childs of Yale University, agreed that the commandment was about truth-telling generally. As Childs pointed out, if the 10 Commandments were solely concerned with truth and falsehood in a courtroom, it would have added words such as, in court. There are many important values in society, but truth is probably the most important. Goodness and compassion may be the most important values in the micro or personal realm, but in the macro or societal realm, truth is even more important than compassion or kindness. Virtually all the great societal evils, such as African slavery, Nazism, and communism, have been based on lies. There were slave traders, Nazis, and communists who were compassionate in their personal lives. but all of them told, and most of them believed, some great lie that enabled them to participate in a great evil. Black slavery was made possible in large measure by the lie that blacks were innately inferior to whites. The Holocaust would have been impossible without tens of millions of people believing the lie that Jews were inherently inferior to so-called Aryans. And communist totalitarianism was entirely based on lies. That's why the Soviet Union's Communist Party newspaper was named Pravda, the Russian word for truth, because the party, not objective reality, was the source of truth. There's only so much evil that can be done by individual sadists and sociopaths. In order to murder millions, vast numbers of otherwise normal, even decent people must believe lies. Mass evil is committed not because a vast number of people seek to be cruel, but because they are fed lies that convince them that what is evil is actually good. However, one big obstacle to truth-telling is that believers in causes, including good causes, that don't place truth as a central value, will be very tempted to lie on behalf of their cause. There are many examples. In the 1980s, for example, to promote the cause of the homeless, the leading activist on their behalf claimed that there were 2 to 3 million homeless in the United States. Years later, he admitted on national television that he had to come up with a number and made that one up. The real number was between 250,000 and 350,000. Similarly, groups in the fight against cancer were caught greatly exaggerating the number of women who get breast cancer each year. Why? In order to frighten more women into getting mammograms. Again, lying on behalf of a good cause. Why is lying on behalf of good causes destructive? Because if we don't know what's true, how and where do we know how to properly allocate society's limited resources? And in the worst cases, it distorts society's priorities and therefore does great harm. The Ten Commandments is there to warn all of us that with very few exceptions, such as the immediate saving of innocent life, no cause is more important than truth-telling. The Ten Commandments is the greatest list of instructions ever devised for creating a good society, but such a society cannot be created or maintained if it is not based on truth. I'm Dennis Prager. Join Prager University.
A society cannot be maintained unless it is maintained on truth. And if you go to our YouTube channel, well, while it's still up, we did put a video on there from Dr. Robert Epstein regarding how Google is trying to manipulate their search results to influence the 2020 election. They're already trying to do that. They're trying to flip votes, and the way they're doing that is by censorship of what you see when you do a Google search. Dr. Epstein knows this stuff inside and out. I recommend you go to youtube.com/NorthstarOasis and you look at this video with Dr. Epstein if you really want to understand more about how Google is actually bearing false witness and not aligned with the truth. And I know I have to laugh because we put our episodes on YouTube, which gets censored, and so my producer and I are sitting here kind of laughing through this, wondering if we're even going to get this show to make it past the YouTube censors. We don't know. Now, if you're watching this on cable TV, you're fine. But if you're watching this on YouTube, we don't know, honestly. And that's kind of what we're laughing about. But it's really sad when I'm pointing out all of these examples of the things that Google and the Democratic Party are all violating all the time. And then we wonder why society is falling apart. Why is there a lot of murder out there? Why is there a lot of adultery out there? Why is there a lot of theft out there? Why do we just have to deal with 3 years of Robert Mueller's investigation over the president with just nothing more than slandering and bearing false witness? Now, we're going to go on to number 10, because commandment number 10 for me is kind of the whole linchpin of the Democratic Party. Do not covet. Because I've heard Democrat friends of mine tell me all the time about pay, equality in pay. Well, why is the CEO of this company making 4,000 times the amount of money on a yearly basis than the average hourly employee? Seems to me that that's coveting. Because you are the hourly employee, or you, if you are that hourly employee, is doing a piecemeal work as part of the process, you think you should have the wages that are necessary for a CEO. You don't take on the same amount of risk as the CEO. So unless you're doing the same type of things that are necessary to take on the risk that a CEO does, you should not be compensated like the CEO, right? Equal work, equal pay. If you're managing a huge corporation, should you not be compensated at the level of what your fellow peers are doing in managing large corporations? Absolutely, you should. If you are just hanging up clothes in the clothing department or shoe department for a retail operation, should you not get the same equivalent amount as every other person doing the same job? Of course you should. But the Democratic Party has this thing that if you make more than everybody else, it's wrong. I'm sorry, but if the CEO of Walmart wants to make $27 trillion, that's fine by me. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to be making $27 trillion, but yet that is the comparison the Democratic Party makes all the time. Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, they make this all the time. This person makes that much, and therefore everybody else should make that much. Oh, no, we can't do that, so everybody else has to make nothing. That's your Democratic Party way. So now let's find out what Dennis Prager has to say about commandment number 10, do not covet.
In the 10 Commandments, Commandments 6, 7, 8, and 9 are the ones that prohibit acts of evil: murder, adultery, stealing, and perjury. And then there is one commandment that prohibits the thing that leads to murder, adultery, stealing, and perjury. Which one is it? It's the last of the 10. Do not covet anything that belongs to others, not their spouse, their house, their servants, their animals, or any of their property. In order to understand this commandment and its unique significance, the first thing to understand is that this is the only one of the 10 Commandments that legislates thought. All the other commandments legislate behavior. In fact, of the 613 laws in the 5 books of Moses, virtually none prohibit thought. Why then does the 10 Commandments include a law that prohibits
Well, it
a
looks
thought?
like we're out of
Because
time. I'm sorry for pontificating so much. For Dallas Pearson, our producer, I'm your host, Jeff Williams. You're watching North Star Oasis. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.